And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another YouTube reading guide series. Today is the first in a 14 video series walking through the correct reading order of Superman by DC Comics. To create this reading guide, I read the 1,677 comic issues that comprise the shared Superman continuity, all the way from 1991 to 2011, including the essential spin-offs, tie-ins, and events. And I've used that knowledge to build this, the internet's most detailed reading guide for the world's most famous superhero. This guide is going to take the form of a Google Sheet that is split into 14 different tabs, representing the 14 discrete eras that I've split this period of Superman reading into. This guide can be viewed and downloaded for free on my website. Generally speaking, each era or tab is going to be separated by a major DC event that I will also be releasing a separate video on. This playlist, the one that you're watching, is going to contain every single Superman video and every single DC event video in the correct viewing sequence. However, if you're only interested in the DC events, they're also going to be collected in a dedicated 11 video playlist that will be available separately on the channel as well. Before we go any further, please do watch the introductory video for this series because that's going to explain lots and lots of things. What triangle numbers are, and why, in fact, I'm starting this reading guide in 1991 rather than actually the sort of post-Crisis on Infinite Earths era. There's quite a lot of information in that introductory video that I would strongly recommend that you do check out. As well as that, it will refer to a few terms like Type P and Type J readers and things like that. And so again, I would strongly recommend you also check out the various vocab explanation videos that I have that explain things like explicit story arc and cross-universe event and so on. But if you don't want to watch those, you want to dive straight in, that's fine. Here we go. You can see on the screen now the actual written guide. As I say, it's a Google Sheet, and today we're covering 119 issues from July 1991 through to October 1993. That means we're covering from the launch issue of Man of Steel, the series, with Man of Steel issue 1, all the way up to and including the Death and Return of Superman arc. What we're going to do today is we're going to go through all of these one line at a time. You can see my cursor on the screen and where I've selected. I'm basically just going to scroll down and then talk about each issue. Remember, if you're going to be using this as your guide, please just go down from one line to the line below to the line below. I know it can look a little bit confusing because we're moving left to right and left to right constantly, but just think about it as this. We're looking at row 3 here. Then we're looking at row 4, row 5, and each time just look at what issue it is on each row. Each row only contains one issue, and that is the sequence in which I'd recommend you order this. Before we jump into it, the first thing I'll mention is that there are some key creators during this era. This is quite an iconic time for Superman comics, when all 4 ongoing series had writers who are still widely known today, with landmark runs that are highly sought after. At the time Man of Steel launches as a series, we have Man of Steel being written by Louise Simonson, Superman being written by Dan Jurgens, Adventures of Superman being written by Jerry Ordway, and Action Comics being written by Roger Stern. So all common household names for anyone who's a comic fan or especially a DC fan. So important time and a good time to start. Let's look at the very first story arc here, which is Return of the Eradicator. You can see from these square brackets around the name that this is an implicit story arc that really should have been explicitly marked on the issues of the covers themselves. So where does it start? Well, it starts here with where we're beginning Man of Steel issue 1. I'm just going to hover over it for a second. You can see there's some note text saying it's triangle number 19. Again, if you want to know what triangle numbers are, please do watch the introductory video, but it's a really key way to organize your comics. You'll be able to see it straight away on the cover of the issue itself. So what we have is Superman Man of Steel issue 1. A couple of things just worth noting here, given that we are obviously diving in at 1991. Issue 1 of Man of Steel has a few aspects within its status quo worth noting. Namely, Lois at this point knows that Clark is Superman, having relatively recently discovered this. They're engaged. Perry White and his wife Alice are in a difficult place in their marriage. It turns out that not only did their son Jerry die recently, it turns out he was actually Lex Luthor's son, conceived after Alice White had an affair. So that's a bit surreal, but there we are. Speaking of Lex Luthor, he's apparently dead. Now, this issue 1 of Man of Steel, actually starts off by talking about the terrorist group Kerberos. Now, they were actually introduced months early in the other series being published, but don't worry, you can easily start here and not get confused. Now, as I say, I was slightly surprised and annoyed to find out that despite not having a numbered kind of blurb on the cover saying Return of the Eradicator or, story part 1, story part 2, these 4 issues are all an explicit crossover. Each one ends with a cliffhanger. You have to read them in this sequence or they make no sense. So, the first issue is Man of Steel issue 1. The next one is Superman 57. Then Adventures of Superman 480. And finally, Action Comics 667. What I'm going to do at the end of each kind of block, so story arc or set of connective issues, is I'll just hover over the comic there, and you can see in the text we're having a quick check-in on the triangle number, so triangle number 22. Remember, you can download this guide for free from my website, and so as a result, all these comics will have a little bit of explanatory text on them. Great, let's move on to the next one, which is just connective issues. Now, connective issues, remember, are just issues that are largely standalone and sort of one and done issues, but are part of an overarching continuity. So, for example, you might have at the start of the connective issue stories, Jimmy Olsen looking to get an apartment, and by the end of the issues, he's got an apartment, something like that. So, there's a clear kind of internal chronology, and there's no harm in reading them in the most sensible linear order. So let's look at this here. We've got Man of Steel issue 2. Hovering over that, we can see this triangle number 23. We then have Superman 58, Adventure of Superman 481, Action Comics 668, and Man of Steel issue 3. I'll take a moment to just sort of pause here on that one. I'll hover over it. You see there's a fair bit of explanatory text there. What I would say about Man of Steel issue 3 is that it's actually part of the ongoing Kerberos storyline, but with a strange tangential magical tale called War of the Gods, which is on the island nation of Tatamalia. This is actually marked and branded on the cover as War of the Gods Part 3, which is part of the larger universe-wide War of the Gods DC event. There will be a video on that in this playlist. Now, this issue is entirely self-contained and can be read in isolation. I'll come back to this event at the end of the video. Next issue we have is Superman 59, then Adventures of Superman 482, and Action Comics 669. You're probably getting used to the cadence here. The next one would be Man of Steel issue 4, Superman 60, Adventures of Superman 483, and then Action Comics 670. Again, you'll see quite a lot of notes on Action Comics 670, and there's a reason for that. This issue actually has the cover branding from the Armageddon 2001 event on the cover. This event is the first in the DC annual events, and that's a publishing habit that continues for the whole 90s. Now, this issue isn't a part of that story directly, nor do you need to read that event to understand this issue, but it's useful to know that's what it is, so you can choose to read it or ignore it if you get intrigued by the branding. I've actually done a previous series of videos on the DC annual events, and the link is in the description. You can see it here on my channel. Please note that issue 670 ends on a brutal cliffhanger that is an implicit arc with the next issue, which is Man of Steel issue 5. Man of Steel issue 5, it actually completes this 2-issue arc. It's about the Atomic Skull, who's kind of a random character, a little bit like Ghost Rider from Marvel, I guess. What's important about Man of Steel issue 5 is the entire issue is in landscape format, not portrait, which is interesting and unusual. And then the final connective issue we have is Superman 61. Again, let's check in on the triangle numbers. This is triangle number 36. Okay, let's scroll down and look at the next story arc. It's actually a story arc called Blackout. Now, this is quite straightforward. If we check in on the very first issue, Adventures of Superman 484, this is triangle number 37. And then going through it, we have Action Comics 671, Man of Steel issue 6, Superman 62, and Adventures of Superman 485. If we check in there, we can see this triangle number 41. This Blackout story is an explicit crossover event, which runs for the 5 issues, as you can see. Note that it does require a little bit of awareness that Superman had defeated a villain called Mr. Z around a dozen or so issues before this guide begins. And again, it refers to the fact that Lex Luthor is dead. However, these two things are in no way major hurdles to understanding the basic story, which is essentially that a former Superman foe attacks Superman and he temporarily loses his memory or temporarily blacks out. Okay, let's then have a look at the next block of connective issues. Again, these are relatively standalone one and dones. We start off with Action Comics 672, which as we can see here is triangle number 42. And then just moving through, we have Man of Steel issue 7. The one thing I'll highlight about this is that it's a triangle number 1 because we're now in 1992 publications and the triangle numbers reset. We then have Superman 63. This issue actually features Aquaman. It is technically set between pages 16 and 18 of Aquaman issue 1. Next up, we have Adventures of Superman 486, Action Comics 673, then Man of Steel issue 8, Superman 64, and finally Adventures of Superman 487. Just checking in, that last issue there is triangle number 7. What I will point out is that the last 5 issues we've just looked at, so from Adventures of Superman 486 downwards, are actually all kind of Thanksgiving, Christmassy episodes in theme. So largely standalone and largely thematically all kind of covering the same thing. Okay, let's look at the next block. We have Panic in the Sky, which is an explicitly branded event. It starts off with Action Comics 674. Let's check in. That's triangle number 8, and that's the prologue issue. Something that you'll note is that this is actually branded as Panic in the Sky prologue on the cover, and all the other issues refer to Panic in the Sky not as being, part 1 or part 2 or part 3, but actually as being strikes for some reason. So what that means is the next issue, which is Man of Steel issue 9, is branded First Strike. Superman 65 is branded Second Strike. Adventures of Superman 488 is branded Third Strike. Action Comics 675 is branded Fourth Strike. And Man of Steel issue 10 is actually branded Fifth Strike. Now, note that the cover for this is an homage to the iconic Crisis on Infinite Earths cover where Superman is holding Supergirl in his arms. You can see the cover here, you can see it's very much a callback to that. Back to the sheet, we then have Superman number 66, which is branded Final Strike. Technically the sixth one, but is branded as Final One. This block actually then ends out with Adventures of Superman 489. Note that this is branded on the cover as Panic in the Sky Epilogue. Now, it does appear to end on a cliffhanger that may make the reader think it's part of an implicit story arc. I certainly thought so. But when I read the next issue, it turns out it doesn't address this cliffhanger until 2/3 of the way through that issue, and then largely as an afterthought. So please don't worry about that. You can read Panic in the Sky as a single block of comics. All right, let's scroll down. We've got more connective issues. So we start off with Action Comics 676. Let's check in. That's triangle number 16. As mentioned, this does not pick up the cliffhanger from the last issue and instead ends on a bit of a revelation of its own, to be honest. We then have Man of Steel issue 11, Superman 67, Adventures of Superman 490, Action Comics 677, Man of Steel issue 12, and we then go into Superman 68. Now, it's worth noting with Superman 68 that whilst this issue reads completely fine as another step in this connective section of single issues, it's actually a key issue for those people who are reading the simultaneous Deathstroke series that was published at the same time, as this issue starts off with Deathstroke on the run and ends up with him under arrest. That makes it pretty critical for anyone reading his self-titled series, which I personally haven't read and I personally have no interest in. And as a result, this goes between Deathstroke 11 and Deathstroke issue 12. Again, as you can see here, there are some notes in the guide there. I'm just trying to be helpful, so I add those in there. After Superman 68, the next issue is Adventures of Superman 491, Action Comics 678, and then Man of Steel issue 13. It's worth noting that Man of Steel issue 13 finally reveals the identity of Kerberos and ends that long-running thread about the terrorist organization. Unfortunately, it's very underwhelming, leaving many unanswered questions, and is never revisited. How annoying. Next up, we have Superman 69, and then Adventures of Superman 492. It's interesting to know that this actually wraps up the Sons of Liberty plotline, which actually predates the first issue that I began reading. In other words, it predates Man of Steel issue 1. This, combined with the rather hasty wrap-up of the Kerberos thread, is our first indication that there's now an increasing editorial mandate to wrap up plot threads in advance of a huge and impactful event that's about to happen, in this case, the death and return of Superman. And the final connective issue in this block is Action Comics 679. It's pretty odd, reintroducing and then wrapping up a previous villain called Shell Shock that was clearly an outstanding loose plot thread. Note that this issue does again reference the events of the Armageddon 2001 event, but that is not a barrier to understanding. Hovering over that, we can see that is Triangle 28. Overall, at this point, I would highlight there's a long-running thread in the background of all the issues so far, especially the discrete connective issues, around worker rights and unionization for the Daily Planet. In this section of connective issues, this then evolves into a conversation about discriminatory hiring practices, representation in the workforce, and positive action. It's interesting, it's nuanced, and it's well worth referring to when people start considering the argument that discussing race politics in comics is a new or woke thing. It's been around since 1992, if not earlier. Let's scroll down now to our seventh block. Our seventh block is the Blaze-Satanis War, an explicit story arc. It starts off with Man of Steel issue 14, Triangle 29, as you can see here. That's an issue that features Robin. Now, it's not part of this crossover explicitly, but it does have a cliffhanger ending that forms an implicit crossover with the next issue, Superman 70. Now, notice that this issue also features Robin and has a cliffhanger ending, and that cliffhanger ending is critical as it leads then into the next issue, Adventure of Superman 493, which is explicitly branded as being part of the Blaze-Satanis War. Similarly branded that way is Action Comics 680, followed by Man of Steel issue 15, and then Superman 71. Now, those 4 issues aren't technically numbered, but the covers have got explicit Blaze-Satanis War branding on them, so it is an explicit story arc, and trust me, that is the order to read them in. We're then following up with some connective issues. We have Adventures of Superman 494, which at this point you will note is triangle number 35. This issue tries to pitch itself as a bit of an epilogue to the Blaze-Satanis War, but honestly it's just a filler issue about the metaphysical considerations of Superman's powers, and it's just had a few lines of dialogue tweaked in a pretty tokenistic way to fit it in here in terms of continuity. Interesting thing about this issue is the first time, at least I'm aware of, we see the character of Kismet. Now she may seem random and irrelevant, but she's actually key to the later Dominus arc. The character of Dominus is surprisingly central to DC mythos, even into the Rebirth and Infinite Frontier era, so there you have it. Next up we have Action Comics 681, and that's just a second connective issue. The next block, block 9, is Crisis at Hand. Now, this explicit two-parter is a frankly excellent story depicting Superman's powerlessness in the face of domestic violence. It starts off with Man of Steel issue 16, which is Triangle 37, and it continues with this one, Superman 72, Triangle number 38. That then takes us to another couple of connective issues. We have Adventures of Superman 495, which is a standalone issue about the New Gods, and we then have Action Comics 682. Interesting to note that Action Comics 682 is the first time we see Doomsday mentioned, on the cover with the Doomsday is Coming tagline appearing. However, this is just another standalone issue. Note that it does not actually contain any images of Doomsday inside at all. So if you want the first ever mention of Doomsday, technically this is the first time the word Doomsday appears in the cover, but he's not in it. Now, before diving into the next quite sizable arc, which is the Death and Return of Superman, we're going to briefly look at this issue, which is the Superman 1992 special. It took me a while to track this down. There have only been a handful of Superman special issues. This one is the only one that ever happens in the 90s, and in fact there isn't another one after this until late in the DC Rebirth era. Now, despite the fact this issue was released at around this time in 1992, the story in it predates any of the issues we've read. So yes, the story in it is set well before Man of Steel issue 1. How do we know that? Because Lex Luthor is alive, and Lois Lane doesn't even know Superman's secret identity, let alone has she agreed to marry him. As such, I'm showing it on the screen here so you're aware what it is. If you're desperate to try and track it down, feel free, but do so with that knowledge. I ignore it in this reading order. It's not relevant. It's not noted down on the reading guide. And I just want to flag it to you in this video in case you come across it and you get confused. At this juncture, it's worth noting we're about to cover 4 consecutive and tightly plotted arcs that all fall under the Death and Return of Superman banner. However, it's important to note that I'm going to structure this as per the content within the issues, given that I've personally read every single one of them. The reason this is important to note is that most collected editions include issues that I don't necessarily agree fall into this Death and Return story, and sometimes neglect things that I think are essential. And so you may find the issues that I consider part of that arc don't always match the conventional wisdom, or even the content of the recent or the various DC omnibuses. However, as I'm going by, unless noted otherwise, the explicit branding on the cover, I stand by my groupings. Let's start here. We've got the Death and Return of Superman Doomsday block right here. So this starts off with Man of Steel issue 17. We are going to just look over there and check in. It's triangle number 41, and obviously it's got a bit of text there to provide some explanation. But it's Man of Steel issue 17, Superman 73, Adventures of Superman 496, and Action Comics 683. Let's pause there for a second. These 4 issues are standard self-contained connective issues. They have nothing to do with Doomsday, except all of them have a final page that is a non sequitur sequence of panels that is simply a fist hitting a wall. In each issue, more of the fist is revealed, and in the 4th issue, in other words, on the 4th page of these panels, the fist finally breaks through and there's a tagline saying Doomsday is here. Now, these 4 pages are the first time that anyone in comics ever actually saw any physical part of Doomsday, and it serves as a teasing introduction for him. A lot of the physical collector's editions, the trade paperbacks or the omnibuses, only collect these 4 issues from these 4 pages from these issues, but they do say in their contents that these issues are contained. So I do know sometimes people try to track down these issues. Don't worry, you're looking at the 4 images here on the screen. This is literally the 4 pages that matter, one from each of these 4 issues. Okay, let's dive back to the map here, and we've got Superman, Man of Steel number 18, that's triangle number 45, just checking in there. And that issue explicitly then leads into Justice League of America number 69. Now, this obviously hasn't got a triangle issue, it's not a Superman comic. And I will note that I haven't read the rest of the JLA in this era, as it's, to be honest, not really modern enough for me. In addition, this is a notably weak time in the JLA history, with a bunch of lesser known characters in their roster like Blue Beetle and Ice, and of course, as we'll see here, Booster Gold. However, this issue is a notable one for involving Doomsday's rampage, and it leads directly into the very first panel of the next issue. And keep in mind, if you just go down by 1 row, that issue is on line 83. It is issue 74, triangle 46. So continuing down, after that we've got Adventures of Superman 497. We then have Action Comics 684, and we then have Man of Steel issue 19. Again, please do note that for Man of Steel issue 19, we're back to triangle number 1, as you can see here, because they've reset. We're now in 1993, as per the covers and the dates on the actual covers of the comics, which is always slightly different to physical publication dates in the real world, but that's a story for another time. And then after that, we have Superman 75. This is the famous landmark issue where Superman is killed. Spoiler warning, I guess, but I mean, come on. Okay, what's the next block? The next block is Death and Return of Superman, Funeral for a Friend, which is unique Funeral for a Friend branding, as we'll talk through in just a second. So the first one is Adventures of Superman 498. Let's just check in. This is triangle number 3, and it's branded Funeral for a Friend. Following this is Justice League of America number 70. It's branded Funeral for a Friend, but doesn't have a number on it. Now, this issue is here as per the reading orders that were actually explicitly in the comics at the time. And it definitely occurs here, as the preceding issue is literally the direct aftermath of Superman's death, with his body still in the street moments later in this issue. Note that, like I say, it's It says Funeral for a Friend in the branding, but it doesn't have a number on it. Getting back into the more normal issues, we have Action Comics 685, which is Funeral for a Friend branded and numbered. And this cover is an homage to Action Comics #1, the first ever appearance of Superman. Obviously, you can see here the iconic lifting the car, smashing it down sort of moment. Back to the Google sheet, it's Man of Steel issue 20. Then Superman 76, Adventure of Superman 499, Action Comics 686, Man of Steel issue 21, and then Superman 77. This has quite a shocking ending, by the way, Superman 77, but I don't want to get into it. That's then followed by Superman number 83. Now, keep in mind, Superman 77, as we see here, has triangle number of 10. Superman 83 has a triangle number of 34. But the reason behind that is that it's branded as a funeral for a friend issue, but actually has nothing to really to do with the funeral for a friend story. In fact, it comes out after the return of Superman, so I have no idea why it exists here. Don't worry, we're going to revisit that later on in the next era, Era 2, as you can see on the bottom there. Before we move on from this, there's just a few random issues that I just want to kind of touch base on. There's a lot of online reading guides, lots of places that seem to have very comprehensive orders. Most of them are wrong because they haven't personally hand read the comics. And they often throw in a few other issues that they say is part of the Death and Return arc. The reason for that is mainly because they feature one of the 4 leads from the Reign of the Supermen, but they're not really part of this whole bit at all. I'll show them on screen here. You've got Superman Annual 5, Action Comics Annual 5, and Adventures of Superman Annual 5, and Man of Steel Annual 2. All 4 of these issues are part of the DC annual event Bloodlines. I mentioned annual events before, and I do talk about them in the prologue video, but long story short, annual events are a completely unique thing DC did in the 90s. I've got a separate playlist for them, which I did several months ago in advance for this particular video, I guess, and check that out on my channel if you'd like. As well as that, people often refer to Steel Annual number 2, which actually came out in 1995 as part of the DC annual event Year Ones. I'm not going to go into why people think it's linked here. I can see why, but it's not. And finally, we have Batman and Superman World's Finest number 9. This is completely unnecessary. Again, I see why people think it's part of this, but you do not need to read it. I do not include it in my reading order. Okay, moving on to the next block, we have Death and Return of Superman, Reign of the Superman, a block so big it doesn't even fit on the screen. Before we even jump into that, there's 2 issues that I haven't even included here, but which you may be interested in. The first one is this one you can see on the screen, which is Legacy of Superman. There's no triangle number for it. It's an interesting issue, and it's set at the same time as Funeral for a Friend, but it's not branded, and it can safely be ignored. Trust me. The next issue sometimes people want to put in here is this. It's called News Time May 1993. It hasn't got a triangle number, but it's quite a clever meta in-universe magazine full of articles about the death of Superman as if it was being written about in the real world. It's a fun read, but it's not branded. It doesn't have a triangle number, and it can be ignored. On that note, let's go back to the Google sheet here. We start off with Adventures of Superman 500. Now, whilst this issue is set between the era of Funeral for a Friend branding and the Reign of the Superman branding that starts in the next issue, it's best collected with the latter, Reign of the Superman, than the former, Funeral for a Friend. There's lots of reasons for that, but just trust me on it. It also has a reference to Blaze from the earlier Blaze-Satanis story arc. So if you're only reading Death and Return of Superman and you're a bit confused by that, that's because you need to go back a bit further to understand that. This issue is pretty iconic. It ends by introducing the 4 new Supermen that are now the main story of this Reign of the Supermen era. Just hovering over number 500, you can see there's Triangle 11. Okay, next up we have Action Comics 687. That's followed by Man of Steel issue 22, and then Superman 78. Subsequent to Superman 78, we have this issue here on the side in miscellaneous again. This is Supergirl and Team Luthor. It has no triangle number, and it goes here given the chronology of a leg injury that Lex gets in this issue. Lex is shown before this issue, no leg injury. After this issue, leg injury. So this is the time you have to read it. That is then followed by Superman number 501, Action Comics 688, Man of Steel 23, Superman 79, Adventures of Superman 502, Action Comics 689, Man of Steel 24, and then Superman 80. Now, Superman 80, we'll just focus on this for a second. It's actually a really, really pivotal issue. It's the issue where, well, I don't want to spoil it, but a massive and pivotal DC moment occurs. As you can see here, it is triangle number 22. Subsequent to that, we have Adventures of Superman 503, Action Comics 690, Man of Steel 25, Superman 81, and then Adventures of Superman 504. I'm going to pause here for a second because Adventures of Superman 504, Triangle 27, and it is absolutely iconic. This is the issue where Superman is basically running around with machine guns. I'm showing a picture of it on the screen here so you can see it. It is wild. It is wild. It's an iconic moment from the 90s, if nothing else. Back to the Google Sheet, we have Action Comics 691, and then Man of Steel issue 26. Man of Steel issue 26 repeatedly references Green Lantern 46, which is the next issue we need to read. You can see that here. It hasn't got a triangle number, but it does have Reign of the Superman branding. And then subsequently, and last but definitely not least, we have the final issue in Reign of the Superman, which is Superman number 82. And if we hover over it, it's triangle number 30. Let's scroll down and we have the very last block here, Death and Return of Superman, The Return of Superman. This is simply 2 issues. We have Adventures of Superman 505, you can see here that's triangle 31, and then subsequently we have Action Comics 692, you can see here that's triangle 32. These 2 issues actually cover the return of Clark Kent rather than the return of Superman, and it's the return of Clark Kent back into the land of the living, so they make a nice ending to this historic event. Okay, there we have it. That's the end of our first era, 119 issues, a bit of a slog. Most of the videos are going to be a lot shorter than this. Most of them are going to be about 50 or 60 issues. One of the videos, in fact, is only going to be 8 issues for reasons that'll be apparent when we get to it. And it's going to be interspersed by events. So for the next video in this playlist, it's actually going to be a DC event for my event playlist, and that's going to be the War of the Gods event. And there we have it. In case you're interested in knowing where these resources are, so the guides, the maps, and so on, they're all available on my website. They're all available for free. You can go into the website, which is nogodsorkings.com, and download the Google Sheet for the Superman reading order, or you can go on the website and look at these reading maps for all the various DC events and a whole bunch of other things I've got on there to your heart's desire. If, however, you are interested in a written version of this guide, then it is available on Amazon. I've recently just self-published it. It is the cheapest possible tier you can get on Amazon. So it's 79 pence UK, 99 cents American, and so on. It's free if you're on Kindle Unlimited, and there is a free sample on the website as well. The reason I put this onto Amazon is kind of a proof of concept. I'm interested to see if people are interested in the written guides, whether or not people want to pick them up. And also it's a good way for me to bat off all the people that are going to be in the comments asking for a Batman guide. If you want a Batman guide, I don't really particularly have any interest in doing one, but I will do one if this book gets 500 reviews. So if this book gets 500 5-star reviews, then I will start doing a Batman reading guide at some point. I don't think that's going to happen, but there we are. Of course, feel free to support the channel by picking this up. Of course, like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, the best way to support the channel is by picking up one of my other books, which isn't a non-fiction reading guide. It's actually a fictional, completely original superhero story. It's prose, so not a comic or words, but it's about superheroes in just a really interesting kind of post-apocalyptic dystopic idea. The first 4 books of the series are out, and if you want to support, please pick that up. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay classy.